I'm John Kallas of Wild Food Adventures. I run a company that takes people out into nature and shows them how to use wild plants for food. I have a website that's wildfoodadventures.com, and at that website you can sign up for workshops, order books, and just get basic information on wild foods. Well, I originally got into wild foods in an indirect way. When I was a kid, I was interested in primitive skills, like interested in being a little Native American kind of a kid. And so I'd be in the woods trying to rub sticks together to make fire. I would be trying to make shelters, bow and arrow from scratch, those kinds of things. And as I got older, I found that I wasn't as interested in that stuff, but I was interested in sort of a survival idea of living off the woods, and that plants were everywhere. I didn't have to hunt for them, I didn't have to fish for them, they were just everywhere that I would go. And so I figured, well, if I just learn the plants, that'll be a fun thing I can do anywhere. There were no teachers, and really all I had was survival books, a couple of wild food books, but in those days, we didn't have the internet, and you just didn't have a connection. If your local library didn't have the right books, you were out of luck. And so, so in any event, I struggled through a lot of that. And then I went to college, and there was an extensive wilderness survival course actually taught as a credit course at Michigan State University. Several hours a week for 10 weeks, several levels of that at different stages. And I was definitely interested in mostly the wild food stuff. And there I started getting more and more resources and access to wild food information. And so the big change came when I decided to vagabond through Europe for about 6 months when I was around 21. I did independent study on edible wild plants at the university. I took an introductory nutrition class and used those wilderness survival skills that I learned, and I vagabonded through Europe for 6 months. I would hitchhike around, and almost everybody who picked me up would be interested in what I was doing, interested in me because I was an American back in those days, maybe not so interested today, but in those days they're very interested. And after a long drive, they'd invite me over. I'd eat dinner at their house. They would invite me to stay overnight, and I would invariably ask whoever the food preparer was, do you collect any wild foods and put them into your dishes? And they would always say yes, because all over Europe people use edible plants that grow around their houses. I'd say, can you show me those plants? And they would. And so as I was going through, I was learning more and more plants, because this would happen once every 3 or 4 days. I get invited to somebody's house, go through the whole thing. This is for 6 months. And by the end of the trip, I was getting all my vegetables from the wild. So I get back to Michigan, and the professors in the department that were teaching the survival course said, hey, we want you to teach a class on wild foods at the university level. And I said, what are you talking about? I don't know anything. And they go, you just went through this great experience, and you may feel like you know nothing, but the thing is, you know more than anybody here. And he goes, that's the definition of an expert. You know more than anybody else. And then I got into my PhD program, which was in nutrition, because one of my professors said, if you really want to advance the field of wild foods, you have to do it in an area. You have to get a PhD in an area that really will add to it. And that was the best field I could think of, and it really did help, by the way. The safety in wild edibles totally depends on your ability to identify plants. So we've got a couple of issues going on here. One is that people don't know plants anymore at all. We're not brought up with plants. We're in sanitized conditions. We're in homes. We've got manicured lawns, and so people just don't know plants. So that's a safety issue just because you're not brought up on it, so it's a new topic. It's a mystery. On the other hand, the plants that are edible, there is a long history behind. There's only 2 kinds of wild edibles. There are the kinds that came over from Europe, which we mostly call edible weeds these days, but these were traditional foods of Europeans. So long history, long established use, not dangerous. We know what we're doing with all of those. And then there were the wild foods from Native Americans that were indigenous to the United States, and those had a long tradition of use and were very safe and used regularly. So the big question is, can you even identify the plant? So that's the biggest thing, is proper identification. And then once you have that identification, do you know the edible parts on the plant? Do you know the proper preparation for the plant? And do you know the season of edibility for each part of the plant that's edible? It's not complicated, it's not rocket science, but it does involve, for each plant, knowing the natural history of that plant. The best skills to have to learn about these things involve just studying plants close up. Just using a book is not very good. Some books are better than others, but the very best thing that you can do, just like everybody in history had their parent teaching them about plants. Well, that's gone now. People have to learn on their own because their parents don't know anything about wild foods anymore. So the next best thing is to find a teacher that can actually show you and take the place of the parent. In lieu of having a teacher around, then you have to use books or learn through tangential sources. And by that I mean taking classes in botany, taking classes in soil science, taking classes in natural history, taking classes in the culture of Native Americans. So you sort of learn around the plants so you can make better judgments when you put all the information together. But there's no substitute for having a parent teaching you as you're growing up about these plants. Native American children used to be with their mothers while the mothers were gathering plants. From birth, they would either be swaddled to the body, or as soon as they're walking around and watching their mother do stuff. By the age of 5, those kids knew more about their food plants than I'll ever know about their particular food plants. Like, I may know a more global idea of what's edible, but a Native American child growing up under those circumstances would know every edible plant at every stage of growth, exactly what it looks like, exactly how to identify it and distinguish it from other plants. So kids can learn this very easily. There are a few extremely poisonous plants in North America. Very poisonous plants indeed, but there are not a lot of species. Now, whether they're commonly found or not, that's a different story. Like here in the Pacific Northwest, poison hemlock, the second most poisonous plant in the country, is everywhere. Water hemlock is very common in the waterways, and that's all over North America. Baneberry is a common poison of the woods. But the key is not trying to avoid poisonous plants. The key is knowing edible plants and just eating what you know. You don't have to worry about poison. Poisonous plants are not going to leap out of the woods and jump in your mouth while you're trying to run away. They're just not going to do that. So as long as you're not grazing aimlessly and just trying to experiment, knowing nothing, and by the way, that's the lazy person's way of doing things. I'm going to guess if this is edible. I'm going to taste this, and if it tastes good, I'm going to eat it. That's very bad news. Never want to do that kind of stuff, because a lot of poisonous plants taste great. The best strategy that anybody can take if they want to learn about wild foods and they don't have any background in this stuff, and they don't have any teachers around, is to learn a plant at a time. You know, be patient. If you learn one plant a week, that's, well, I'd say during the growing season, you're learning 30 plants a year. That's a lot of plants. A lot of plants. And if you have good enough resources to do that, that's actually very possible.